Welcome to Mr. Hutchings' History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to plunge headfirst into a really fascinating and controversial period, actually.
Wow, yeah.
Yeah, U.S. foreign policy. President Nixon's actions in Chile
Wow.
in the early 1970s.
Okay.
And we've got some really incredible sources for you today.
Awesome. I'm excited.
Yeah, historical accounts. We've got some declassified documents, even some economic analyses, just to give us a really, a complete picture of what was going on.
That's great.
So picture this. The Cold War, tensions are high, and a Marxist leader named Salvador Allende has just come to power in Chile.
Oh, wow.
This had Washington on edge, needless to say.
Mm.
So our big question that we're really going to wrestle with today is, did Nixon orchestrate a coup to overthrow Allende?
Right.
And what were the lasting effects of what he did?
It's interesting because right off the bat, we need to remember these events still impact how the U.S. is viewed in Latin America even today.
It's true. It's true. It's easy to forget how much history just keeps, echoing into the present. Okay, so let's rewind back to the 1970s. Nixon's foreign policy was pretty different from the presidents who came before him.
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
Huh.
He really pushed this idea of trade, not aid. It was a really sharp turn away from policies like Kennedy's Alliance for Progress,
Right.
which had focused more on direct economic assistance.
Okay.
Nixon, he believed that promoting economic growth through trade was the way to go.
Okay, interesting. So did this trade, not aid approach actually work? Was it more effective than just giving aid directly?
Well, that's where it gets complicated.
Okay.
I mean, promoting trade sounds great on paper, but for countries like Chile,
Uh-huh.
who are already struggling with, economic issues, cutting off aid and just relying on trade could actually make their situation worse.
Oh, wow.
It's a debate that historians still go back and forth on even today.
Interesting, interesting. So it seems like there were a lot of different factors at play here. Was Chile under Allende really seen as this, looming threat by the Nixon administration?
Oh, there was significant concern. Definitely. Remember, this is the Cold War and the idea of another communist stronghold in the Americas, especially after Cuba.
Right.
It was like a nightmare for the U.S.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And then Allende's policies, things like nationalizing industries,
Uh-huh.
particularly the copper industry,
Yeah.
which the U.S. had a huge stake in.
Right.
That just amplified their fears.
Okay, so it sounds like alarm bells were definitely ringing in Washington. But did Nixon's involvement in Chile begin only after Allende's victory in 1970?
Actually, no. U.S. involvement goes back even further.
Oh.
To the 1964 Chilean presidential election.
Okay.
The U.S. secretly gave, get this, $20 million to support Allende's opponent.
Wow.
That's over $150 million today.
That's a lot of money.
It really shows how far they were willing to go to prevent, a socialist leader from gaining power.
Yeah, $150 million in today's money would be, a drop in the bucket for some of these campaigns. But back then, that was serious money.
Oh, yeah.
Clearly, they were very invested in influencing the outcome.
Yes, and you really have to understand this in the context of the Cold War. The U.S. genuinely believed that stopping the spread of communism was absolutely paramount anywhere in the world.
So despite these efforts, Allende won the 1970 election, even though it was a really close one.
Yeah.
I imagine that sent shockwaves through the Nixon administration.
Absolutely. Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, they saw Allende's victory as a huge setback.
Uh-huh.
They were worried that his socialist policies would not only affect U.S. investments, but it could potentially set off a domino effect,
Right.
inspiring other Latin American nations to follow.
I see. So what was Nixon's plan at this point? How did he respond to this perceived threat?
He chose a two-pronged approach: economic pressure and covert action. He wanted to squeeze Allende from both sides.
Okay, let's unpack that a little bit. Let's start with the economic pressure.
Yeah.
How did Nixon go about putting the squeeze on Chile?
His famous quote was to make the Chilean economy scream.
Wow.
He cut off financial aid, he cut off loans, he imposed all these trade restrictions, all designed to cripple the Chilean economy
Uh-huh.
and destabilize Allende's government.
That's a very aggressive approach. But then there's this other side of it, this covert action.
Right.
I'm really curious about this Project FUBELT. What can you tell me about that?
Okay, so Project FUBELT was a top-secret CIA operation, and Nixon himself authorized it.
Wow.
And the goal was very simple: to remove Allende from power by any means necessary.
So you've got this economic pressure happening out in the open, but What were some of the covert actions being taken to undermine Allende?
Well, the CIA was doing a whole range of things. They were funding opposition groups. They were backing strikes to disrupt the economy, which was already fragile.
Right.
They were even making contact with people in the Chilean military who were open to a coup.
Wow. So they were really pulling out all the stops, huh? Orchestrating this economic hardship, fueling unrest. It seems like that would be a recipe for disaster.
Well, it was a high-risk strategy, and it definitely had its setbacks.
Why?
There was an attempt to assassinate General René Schneider,
Okay.
who was the head of the Chilean army,
Yeah.
but that backfired tremendously.
How so?
Well, it actually created sympathy for Allende,
Oh, wow.
and it kind of united the Chilean people against foreign interference.
So after all this covert action, the economic pressure, I mean, the stage was set for the 1973 coup.
Yeah. On September 11th, 1973, General Augusto Pinochet led the Chilean military in overthrowing Allende's government.
Mm-hmm.
It was a violent event, and Allende actually died during the siege of the presidential palace. Pinochet then established a really brutal dictatorship that would rule Chile for the next 17 years.
So this coup was a pivotal moment, not just for Chile, but for the whole region. The big question that historians are still debating is the extent of Nixon's direct involvement in the coup. What does the evidence suggest?
Well, there's no question that the U.S. under Nixon was a major player in destabilizing Allende's government.
Right.
And we know this because of declassified CIA documents. They show the extent of their efforts.
Mm-hmm.
But the exact nature of Nixon's role in the coup itself is still a matter of debate.
Yeah, it sounds like a very tangled web of events and motivations. And the aftermath of this coup had devastating consequences for Chile, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Pinochet's regime was known for its human rights violations. Thousands of people were imprisoned, tortured, and executed just for their political beliefs. It's a very dark chapter in Chilean history.
A dark chapter indeed.
Mm.
And one that raises a lot of questions about the U.S. role, not just in the events leading up to the coup, but also in their support of the Pinochet regime afterward.
Yeah, that's a discussion we definitely need to have. But before we dive into the long-term consequences and the U.S. role in the aftermath, let's pause here for a moment. When we come back, we'll explore how these events impacted not just Chile, but the whole region. You know, you're absolutely right. The repercussions of that 1973 coup went way beyond Chile's borders. I mean, it really shook the whole region.
Like throwing a rock into a pond, right? Those ripples just keep spreading out.
Exactly.
So let's talk about those long-term consequences.
Wow.
What were some of the biggest impacts, both within Chile and in Latin America as a whole?
Well, first off, you can't ignore the economic fallout. Allende's government was already facing economic challenges, but the U.S. sanctions and the covert actions, all that economic strangulation, just made things worse.
So the U.S. was trying to weaken Allende, but they actually created the perfect conditions for Pinochet to step in and impose his own radical economic agenda.
Exactly. Pinochet, he was guided by this group of U.S.-trained economists. They were called the Chicago Boys. And they implemented these sweeping neoliberal reforms, and those reforms had mixed results.
How so?
Well, some parts of the Chilean economy did see some growth, but at a huge cost. Inequality just went through the roof.
It's like they traded one set of problems for another. And it makes you think about the long-term impact of those kinds of like really rapid, drastic economic shifts.
Mm.
What about the impact on democracy in the region? It feels like a dangerous precedent was set with the Chilean coup.
You're right on the money there. The Chilean coup started this ripple effect across Latin America. It really emboldened other military forces in the region and led to this wave of U.S.-backed dictatorships overthrowing democratically elected governments.
Wow.
This pattern of intervention, this whole cycle of coups and dictatorships, it really cast a long shadow over Latin America. It hindered democratic development for decades.
It's a good reminder that democracy is fragile. Especially when you've got these powerful external forces involved, those ripples can turn into tidal waves.
Oh, that's a great way to put it. And it's exactly why all this debate among historians about U.S. intervention in Chile is so important. There are all these different perspectives, different ways of looking at these events, each with their own arguments and implications.
Okay, so let's break down those different perspectives. What are some of the main viewpoints that historians bring to the table when they're analyzing the U.S. role in Chile?
Well, one school of thought, the Orthodox view, they basically argue that Nixon's actions were all part of this big Cold War chess game.
Okay.
They believe that the U.S. was justified in doing whatever it took to contain the spread of communism, even if it meant supporting a brutal dictator like Pinochet.
So from that perspective, it's all about choosing the lesser of two evils. preventing the spread of communism,
Mhm.
even if it meant kind of sacrificing democratic ideals.
That's the gist of their argument. But then you've got revisionist historians, and they offer a much more critical perspective.
Okay.
They condemn U.S. foreign policy in Latin America.
Mm-hmm.
They say that supporting Pinochet was just completely disregarding human rights and democratic principles.
Yeah.
For them, it was a betrayal of American values, all to protect U.S. economic and political interests.
It sounds like a real clash of values, national security, and the fight against communism versus upholding democratic ideals and human rights. Is there any middle ground in this debate?
There is. Post-revisionist historians, they acknowledge the Cold War context, the fears and pressures that were influencing U.S. foreign policy, but they also emphasize the long-term damage that U.S. intervention caused. They argue that Nixon's Realpolitik approach this idea of achieving your goals by any means necessary was short-sighted and ultimately backfired.
So Realpolitik as a strategy, maybe it seemed effective at the time, but it created this legacy of instability and repression that ended up hurting U.S. interests in the region.
Exactly. And it's important to define Realpolitik for our listeners. It's a political philosophy that puts practical considerations first, often at the expense of morals or ethics. It's about power, about achieving your objectives, even if it means making tough, sometimes unpleasant choices.
It sounds like a slippery slope. When you start putting power above everything else, where do you draw the line?
That's the real question, isn't it? And then to make things even more complex, you've got the realist historians. They come at it from a different angle. They say that Nixon's actions were just practical responses to the realities of the Cold War.
Yeah.
They basically say, look, the U.S. had to do what it had to do to protect its interests in a world dominated by this rivalry between superpowers.
So for them, it's all about national interest. They're saying that the U.S. was playing by the rules of the game, even if those rules were morally questionable.
You got it.
Yeah.
And this takes us back to this fundamental question that keeps coming up throughout history. How much can we justify sacrificing our values, our principles, to achieve what we think are important strategic objectives? It's a question that's still being debated not just about Chile, but about U.S. foreign policy all over the world.
That's a question that feels so relevant even now as we deal with foreign policy challenges today and try to navigate this complex world.
For sure. And I think it's crucial for us as citizens to be aware of these historical debates, to understand the different ways we can look at these complicated events. It helps us develop a more nuanced perspective, a deeper understanding of what shapes our world.
Like you said at the beginning, this isn't just about history. It's about understanding the present and ultimately making better decisions about the future.
Precisely. And as we consider the lasting effects of the Chilean coup, it's so important to understand that this event still shapes how the U.S. is seen in Latin America.
So even after all these years, those ripples are still being felt. What are some of the lingering perceptions? How do people in the region view the U.S. as a result of these actions?
The Chilean coup is often used as a prime example of U.S. interventionism, a case study in how the U.S., driven by its own interests, can undermine democracy and support authoritarian regimes. It's created this deep distrust of U.S. motives and this narrative of U.S. imperialism that's still around today.
It reminds us that actions have consequences, and those consequences can last for generations. It makes you wonder about the long-term cost of these interventions, not just in human suffering, but also in diplomatic relations and international trust.
You're absolutely right. But before we wrap up our deep dive into Nixon's actions in Chile and talk about some potential lessons for the world today, let's take a step back. What stands out to you about all of this?
It really does seem like a complex legacy, trying to reconcile those national interests with the desire to promote democracy and human rights. It's a tough balancing act.
Oh, for sure. And I think for the U.S., those two goals really clashed in Chile.
They did. And it raises some big questions about the limits of U.S. power, right? And how easily interventions can backfire.
Absolutely. So thinking about everything we've discussed, what can we learn from all this? How can we apply these insights to the foreign policy challenges we face today?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it?
It is. I think for me, it highlights how important it is to approach foreign policy with a deep understanding of history. We have to recognize the complexities of intervention and how easily things can go wrong.
So avoiding those simplistic solutions.
Exactly, and recognizing that there are no quick fixes in global affairs.
Right. And it makes me think about how important diplomacy and multilateralism are, working with international partners instead of going it alone.
Yeah, building coalitions, encouraging dialogue, finding common ground instead of resorting to unilateral action.
It seems like the big takeaway is that foreign policy is never black and white. There are always trade-offs, and navigating those trade-offs requires a lot of thought ethical reflection, and a willingness to learn from past mistakes.
I completely agree. And I think it's so important for us as citizens to be engaged in these discussions about foreign policy. We need to hold our leaders accountable and demand transparency in the decisions they make.
So this deep dive into Nixon's actions in Chile has been about more than just revisiting a historical event. It's about giving ourselves the tools to think critically about the U.S. role in the world today and understand the impact of our actions.
Exactly. And as we wrap up our exploration of this fascinating and controversial chapter in U.S. foreign policy, I want to leave you with something to think about. How can we as individuals contribute to creating a more just and equitable world order? How can we make sure our actions, both here at home and abroad, promote democratic values, human rights, and sustainable peace?
That's a really powerful question to consider. It reminds us that history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding how those events continue to shape our present and how we can use those lessons to create a better future. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into U.S. foreign policy. We hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking, and we hope it encourages you to keep exploring these important issues.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings' History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.